Hi, and welcome back. We are here for another episode of the Sky's the Limit Fund podcast. And just briefly, I will introduce myself and then tell you a little bit about Sky's the Limit Fund before we dive into today's topic. I'm Brenda Zane. I'm a lucky board member on Sky's the Limit Fund who gets to do these interviews and talk with incredible people and just bring a little bit more light and information to folks about wilderness therapy, about some of the folks who work in the wilderness therapy field. They're incredible people. And we do this because we really want to highlight all of the incredible resources that are out there for families. And Sky's the Limit Fund exists because we really work hard to bring families who are in a state of crisis, who need a placement for their either adolescent or young adult, and are not able to fully fund the wilderness experience. It is an incredibly effective modality of therapy. It is also incredibly expensive. So we are fortunate enough to be able to have incredible donors who help support us, and then we are able to pass those funds along to families so that they can get the support that they need. And when the young person comes home, we also wrap that family and the young person in support. And so it's kind of a win-win all around. So that's what we do at Sky's Limit Fund. And today we have a guest with us who's going to talk on a very interesting topic that I'm excited to hear about because I don't know a whole lot about it. We're going to be talking with Sarah James, who's the primary therapist at Trails Carolina, which is one of our wilderness therapy partners at Sky's the Limit Fund. And we're going to be talking about neurodiversity and specifically some concepts about and information about neurodiversity in girls. So I'm really excited for this topic, and welcome, Sarah.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
Great. This is going to be a really interesting topic because I have heard, and I don't know a lot about it, but I have heard that there are some really unique nuances about neurodiversity and girls, and also some of the struggles that come with that, especially in those adolescent years. So thrilled to have you on and to talk about this. Why don't you just give us a quick bio or background on you so we kind of understand who you are, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. So again, my name is Sarah James. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor and a licensed clinical addiction specialist in the state of North Carolina. I'm the primary therapist at Trails Carolina for a group of adolescent girls aged 14 to 17. And specifically, my group is like the quirky girl group. We've got the neurodiversity, often they're like the introverted, struggling socially, but really desiring social connection, and have been probably wounded in that area. And there's a lot of self-esteem and empowerment stuff that we work on along with that.
Yeah. Wow, that's got to be. I just remember being an adolescent girl, and it was so hard, even without the neurodiversity, right? So it's just amazing that there's a resource like this. So before we really dive in, can you just tell us when somebody says neurodiversity, what does that mean? Because there's probably a lot of misconceptions about that.
Yeah, and it's such a buzzword these days, and it's a
Yeah.
really big umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of things. Um, so so generally, it refers to a variety of different diagnoses and like symptoms that don't quite fit a diagnosis. So typically, when I say neurodiversity, I'm referring to things in the realm of ADHD, autism. There's some more like really specific diagnoses within that category, such as like social pragmatic communication disorder, where there's like a specific aspect or list of symptoms that apply. There's more research about conditions that aren't like official diagnoses yet. Like I hear a lot of women talking about I'm a highly sensitive person, or HSP. So there's things like that kind of fall under the neurodiversity umbrella. But generally, I think it means a person whose nervous system is wired in a way that what is considered normal in our society is not in alignment with how they see the world or interact with the world. Yeah.
Which makes it really hard, really hard to
Yeah.
fit in, right? With all of the pressure on young people today. And I'm glad that you said that there's sometimes a variety of symptoms, because just not really having experience in this area, I would sort of assume that there's always a very clear diagnosis, and I'm hearing that that might not be the case.
No, especially when we start looking at like the nuances of it. Um, like sometimes we look at this list, which I can get into what that list kind of is, and parents will say, "Oh, that's my kid," or sometimes it's like, "Oh, well, they do this but not this, and they didn't used to have these struggles and now they do." Um, yeah, and the whole like diagnosis question is kind of in mental health diagnosis in general, but I think particularly with the neurodiversity diagnoses, can be this kind of like echo chamber where it's like, okay, what is ADHD? It's this list of symptoms. Why do they have these challenges? Because they have ADHD. But what is it?
Right.
And there's just not a lot, like we don't have enough research on the brain and neurology to really, like, it's not like a physical health thing where you can just point to like it's a problem with your liver or whatever.
Right. There's no blood test basically that's going to come back and say, oh, you have
Yeah.
ADHD or you have autism. So that's
Yeah.
probably pretty tricky for parents. So what are some of the things that they might be seeing in an adolescent, or maybe, more in the tween age? Are there some sort
Mm-hmm.
of obvious things that they might be seeing?
Yeah, and I also want to step back too and recognize that a lot of the families I work with kind of fall in two camps. There's one camp where they actually have gotten a diagnosis early on, and they have done everything they can to get all the services and kind of do everything right. And here we are getting to middle school or high school and we're still struggling, or the things that used to work aren't anymore. And then there's the camp where this is all new and we're starting to notice these things that we didn't really notice before. And this is like a whole new world to wrap our heads around. So some of the more obvious things, or kind of more like clinical things, like what you might hear a clinician or a book tell you about, signs of potential neurodiversity. That can include cognitive inflexibility, so like black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, some rigidity around like their preferences, their beliefs. They can be pretty impatient sometimes. Sometimes they struggle with empathy and perspective taking. Um, Another thing can be hyperfixation. So either like the classic autism thing is like really niche interests and really only interested in these, like trains or whatever is like the classic example. And that's all they want to talk about. Or maybe the hyperfixation might be like struggling to let things go, like a perceived injustice or something like that. Particularly with like ADHD or attentional challenges, I think the idea or the stereotype is like, oh, they just can't focus, like they can't sit still. But sometimes it looks like they can really focus in the things they're interested on, and it's hard to get them to shift or give that same attention to other topics. Um, there can be struggles reading, interpreting, or responding to social cues. They can be sometimes, they come off as like blunt or like really direct, kind of abrasive sometimes. Attention deficits can be hard to concentrate. They can appear like scattered, disorganized, have difficulty finishing what they start a lot of times. Another sign can be sensory sensitivities, so like really particular about how clothing feels, or different lighting might bother them, or like being in a crowd or certain sounds might be overstimulating. And then the last thing I have is emotion regulation, so struggling to articulate their feelings. This type of kid might go from 0 to 100 really quick in terms of their emotions, or vice versa, like they get over things really fast. And then the more like abstract, subjective, nuanced type of things, emotions, can be really hard and challenging for them to understand and cope with.
Okay, those
And
are
I think that's
great.
why, yeah, this kind of second camp of we're getting to middle school, high school age, and this is a new thing, is often, like high school social relationships get more complex, and the academic workload relies more on like critical thinking, problem solving, abstract reasoning. And so those are the things that kind of are extra challenging for a neurodiverse kiddo. And so that's when things start to get harder, is these teenage years.
Right. And I can see that, oh gosh, just the pressures of school and fitting in and not, acting differently than other kids could be so challenging. And also as a parent, just knowing, like, your kid and that's just how they are. And so I can see how you might not think that this is any kind of a diagnosis because this is just how your kid is, right? And so to
Yeah.
start to see, oh, okay, other kids in middle school aren't doing this, or mine is just reacting so differently than other kids, could start to sort of raise those bells. And then are there some things that maybe were, as a parent, you would not necessarily recognize, kind of the less obvious things that you could highlight for us that you would go, "Oh, actually, yeah, I'm seeing that."
Yeah, definitely. And the one thing I want to say about what you just said is often sometimes it gets overlooked because parents are like, well, I do that too. And I'm okay.
Right,
Or like sometimes
right.
they're looking at their kids struggling and they're like, oh, like not everyone does that.
Right.
um,
Yes. And especially I would imagine if it's the oldest or if it's an only child, because you don't have the contrast maybe to
mm-hmm.
see in a sibling, or, that it's like, well, I don't know, this is just how they are. And I think we'll talk in a minute too about what, kind of the pros and cons of having a diagnosis, because I could see how that would start to get a little complex to say, well, they're perfectly fine how they are. They have these quirks, but there's nothing wrong. It's not a disease, right? So, but maybe share with us some of those less obvious signs that a parent might overlook if they're not aware of them.
Sure. Yeah. Another way I think about this is like the practical side of how this can actually look or show up in your home. So one sign that's pretty common is your kid comes home from school and either has some sort of meltdown or temper tantrum, or they just like isolate in their room. And this is often because it takes a lot of energy and either white knuckling or masking to get through the day at school. And they come home and they are just like exhausted of doing that. And home is like their safe place where they can take the mask off and fall apart a little bit. Um, you might start to notice increasing reliance on online social connections or a high volume of screen time, or maybe tech addiction kind of thing, where the online world socially has more black and white rules and can make more sense to these kids. And so that's not inherently wrong, but it can start to get problematic if they're not being careful about verifying the identity of the people they're talking to, or they're getting into these like really specific corners of the internet and things like that, or just like the volume of time they're spending on a screen is interfering with the rest of their life. These kiddos might have like hot and cold relationships, like yesterday they were my best friend and today I hate them because they did this one thing wrong. These kiddos can be pretty vulnerable to peer pressure because they so desire that social connection and they really want to fit in and they want to have friends, and they don't. It's hard. It's like extra hard. It's hard as any teenager, but for these kiddos,
Yeah.
they because they struggle with that nuance and the unspoken rules of the social world, they can kind of resort to taking shortcuts socially. So that can look like engaging in some risky behaviors because that gets them like some social connection points. And often they confuse attention with connection, like because I get a laugh out of people, or because people include me if I say, yes, I'll smoke weed with you. And it's driven by, I really want social connection.
Yeah.
Um, there might be school avoidance or sometimes challenges with school that weren't always there before. So like I said, when the work starts getting more complex, there's less memorization, there's less fact-based things, there's less like concrete content in the academics. So they might start struggling when before things might have been okay with school. Often, not always, but a big kind of sign for me is when a parent tells me, oh, well, you know, she's 17, but when you interact with her, she feels a lot more like 14 or 13. So like the emotional maturity or the innocence or that naivety might feel a little bit like someone younger.
Yeah.
And then sometimes there's a lack of either body awareness or like the mind body connection isn't quite there. So an example of that is like I complain a lot of a stomach ache, and I don't know, like sometimes that means I'm anxious or I'm upset about something. It's not always like something I can fix in my body. And then sometimes too, there's a lack of tolerance for physical discomfort or like a general kind of lack of resilience or perseverance, particularly when things are physically hard. Yeah.
Very interesting. I'm sure that for people who are listening, the bells are probably going off like, oh, yeah, that sounds familiar. And I just think it's great to know because I've had people say to me, well, I can't send my daughter, I can't send my son to wilderness because they have Asperger's or they're autistic. And I would love to ask you about the language too around that, whether I'm saying that. Is it you have Asperger's or you, I don't know how to say that, but I think there is a misperception that if your young person is struggling with some of these neurodiverse things that they're like, well, I guess I can't send them because they're never going to be able to manage in the wilderness. And so I love hearing that there are people like you who really specialize in this, and that's your whole group has these what is the language? Do you say conditions or I want to be want to make sure I'm using
Yeah,
the
that's
right
a good
language.
question. And this is such a like slippery slope. Well, first, Asperger's isn't like officially a diagnosis anymore. A lot of people know what that means. And so, like, colloquially, people still use that. But now it's just all autism spectrum. And they
Okay.
break it down in kind of like level 1, level 2, level 3 would be like the most severe. And level 1 is kind of like the classic Asperger's. We're struggling socially. Um, we've got some of those fixed interests and things like that. But we like, I don't like the word high functioning, but that's a word that people will use. I'd say languaging people on the spectrum,
Okay.
autistic individuals. There's this great empowering neurodiversity movement out there who are kind of like reclaiming it as an identity. Like, yeah, I'm autistic, and that's like a good thing. Like, there's a
My
unique way that I see the
superpower.
world, and yeah, yeah. Um, so I think as long as you're not being like derogatory, there's not necessarily that I know of a wrong way to say it.
Yeah, well, I always like to ask because I think language is so important,
Yeah.
and labeling young people in particular, I think can be, and we could talk about that is the, and then I want to get into girls specifically, but is it, if a parent is listening to this and all the bells are going off like, yep, 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 is a diagnosis, first of all, is a diagnosis mandatory? And then whether or not it's something that could potentially be a negative, or could we turn it into a positive for our kids?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's a hard decision to make. It's going to really depend on you and your family and your specific needs. I'd say what it comes down to, the diagnosis, the purpose of it is to get access to services or medications. So if you are looking at your child struggling in school and you're thinking about getting an IEP or something, or asking for more support in school, a diagnosis will be helpful for that so that you can qualify for the bureaucratic things.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and, depending on the family and the child, the diagnosis might be helpful for that like identity piece. Like, okay, this is a thing with a name, and here are now all these books that I can read and other people in a community that I can find. And it can open up a world where, because I have a name for it, I can find things that I can do about it. Of course, you're not going to like cure it. It's not a problem. It's not something to be solved, but it can be positive in that way, where it's framed in a more empowering light. I think too, kind of on the empowering positive side of it, a lot of times, especially if we're in that middle school, high school age, and this is something new that we're discovering, a lot of times up until this point, we've been looking at this child's behaviors in a way that's like, oh gosh, like, why are they doing this? And getting that diagnosis can help shift the thinking about like, what are the intentions behind these behaviors and what's really going on underneath why this kid is struggling. So that can be empowering to shift it that way. And then, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, there's like a whole neurodiversity movement out there where people are looking at the strengths and the positives and the uniqueness that can be offered as kind of most diversity things will
I think
include.
that's really cool. I think that's really, really encouraging too, because I know, just, anecdotally, that often these kids are the most brilliant kids also. And so
Yeah,
I think it's really cool to be able to claim that and say, this is my superpower. Yeah, I might have some quirks, but to be able to find others as well that are like you could be really cool. Um,
yeah,
I know that we wanted to talk and touch on a bit, how this impacts girls, because it sounds like there's some differences, and so maybe just talk a little bit about that and why it would be important to really recognize those things in girls.
sure. I think this is fortunately something that's being talked about more, but historically, all of the, like for autism specifically, all of the tests that were designed to kind of make the diagnosis were normed on boys. And when
Perfect.
yeah, because boys are the ones that are like more likely to act out what's happening for them,
Right.
whereas girls are more socialized to like be good and be nice and play by the rules and more likely to um, value social connections and relationships with other people in a way that that is like a motivator for their behavior, so they can develop the skills, like a lot of times we'll call it like masking, or I can like get through my day and I can be polite and I can follow the rules and I can get an A on my test, but actually that's what's going on inside is like a whole storm of difficulty
Right.
and emotions and like confusion. So girls just tend to internalize a little more rather than externalize, so it doesn't become a problem until later. And that's kind of the other thing about diagnosis too, is like, is this really impeding your life in a way that a diagnosis would be helpful, or do you just like relate to this list of symptoms and you're like kind of the parents are sometimes like, well, I do that and I'm okay. And that can be true. Like, this doesn't mean that these symptoms or signs don't automatically mean you need to jump to get a diagnosis, because it might not be a problem or interfere with your
Right.
life. You just might have to like adapt a little and know what you need and what kind of things suit your nervous system better. Um, but often for a girl specifically, kind of like I've mentioned, high school becomes that age where the academics are more complex, the social relationships are more complex, and it's a lot harder to do that white knuckling and that masking, and things start to kind of fall apart and we realize there are some foundational pieces missing here.
Are
um,
they Do you feel like girls are a little bit more at risk for kind of dipping into risky behavior, substance use, or self-harm or anything like that as a way of coping with this and trying to fit in? Because there is such pressure to fit in.
yeah, I think it's easy to find some sort of community, particularly with like if we're really relying on online social relationships, it's easy to find unhealthy online social communities, or in school social communities, like kind of like how I mentioned earlier, that the cutting or the drinking or whatever is going to gain me some sort of social capital, or like, yeah, I really have no clue how to deal with this overwhelming emotion. Heard about this other girl who cut herself and I'm going to try it. um, Things like that can be a real slippery slope for neurodiverse girls. I also want to mention
Yeah.
too, I mentioned this earlier, kind of the language piece. this could be a whole other topic, but I do want to mention that there's a really high correlation that we're starting to look more at, where typically like girls on the spectrum, there's an overlap with gender diversity too. And there's a whole list of things we could talk about with that, but I want to acknowledge the people that I'm talking about right now don't always identify as girls at this age, and they're questioning their gender, or they're relating to, more their masculine side, or things like that.
Oh,
And that's a whole
interesting. Yeah.
adult things.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a whole nother topic that could be very confusing too, especially as you get into adolescence. And oh, my heart just really goes out to these kiddos because it's so tricky. And for parents too, to know what to do to not kind of squash the beautifulness and uniqueness and, specialness that comes with a kid like this, but to help them find healthier ways to fit in so that you're not getting into that substance use. Because I could imagine for somebody who has the awkwardness, the minute you take a drink, wow, that could really solve a lot of those problems in a really unhealthy way. And so that it seems like it could be heightened even more for a neurodiverse young person than somebody who doesn't struggle with that necessarily, that awkwardness. So it would just be, that's just super complex. So
Or like,
when they get to you,
yeah.
you've got a lot to untangle.
Oh yeah. And often it's pretty easy to untangle, like, oh, you did this because, this makes sense and it worked for you at the time. And so a lot of parents, I think, want to, again, like, focus on the behavior. And I do a lot of work around, let's understand what was driving that behavior. It doesn't necessarily mean it was okay, but it worked for a while, which is why they kept doing it. And now we just need to learn healthier and more actually fulfilling ways to cope with the struggles that led you to whatever behavior is the thing that got us looking at more intense intervention.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like that could be where a diagnosis, or whether it's formal or not, right? Even just identifying you have some of these traits could be helpful so that the young person, like you said, has access to resources or can even just do their own research to say, oh, okay, I'm not broken. There's not something wrong with me. I just have this uniqueness about me. And here's how other people kind of manage that and become really successful at some of these things. So
Yeah,
such a
totally.
fascinating topic. Thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we could have like another 3 hours of conversation around it, but we'll make sure and share this so that I think you had provided some resources as well so that parents can, if you're listening and you're identifying with some of this, to just know, I think it's just so wonderful to know, okay, there are people out there who have this experience and can help a young person who's really struggling, and that wilderness is still an option, because I've heard that so much. Parents think wilderness is not an option because I have a neurodiverse kid and I don't know how that would work. So amazing to know that there is resource out there. So Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and have a really, really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. There's so much more we could say. And yeah, I would just say to parents who this topic has got you curious, yeah, look into it, look behind it, and try to find places where you and your kid can meet in the middle. So a lot of what we end up working on when we get more into this is the balance of kind of personal ownership and responsibility, and this is your life, and here are the skills that you can develop to make your life more manageable, and adapting the environment, which is what we do in wilderness. It's like a both and, adapting the environment to make it a little less hard for you.
Yeah.
And it can't be one or the other. It can't be all just like you need to change, and it also can't be the environment being like, okay, we're gonna like cushion everything.
Right.
So looking for ways to find that balance, looking again for the intention behind the behavior, I guess, would be my takeaway.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you so much.